Trauma is sometimes used somewhat loosely and promiscuously to refer to things that are not traumatic. So people will have a difficult experience and say, I was traumatized. No, they weren't. They just had a difficult experience. And as one of my colleagues points out, all trauma is stressful, but not every stress is traumatic. So sometimes people use the word to refer to difficult experiences, which is not the same as being traumatized. Trauma is not understood nearly enough or used nearly enough, so that, to my mind, a lot of conditions of mind and body are actually very much trauma-related without the healing profession, particularly the medical profession, actually recognizing it. So trauma then it comes from the Greek word for wounding. Trauma is a wound. It's a psychic wound that leaves a scar, it leaves an imprint in your nervous system, in your body, in your psyche, and then shows up in multiple ways that are not helpful to you later on. So in its basic sense, trauma is a psychic wound. And if you look at the nature of a wound, on the one hand, if it's raw and open, it really hurts. So when somebody touches that wound that you sustained a long time ago, but it hasn't healed yet, you'll react like you're just being tormented all over again. This happens in relationships all the time. On the other hand, wounds scar over, and the scar tissue has certain features. It's very hard, it's rigid, so it's not flexible. So people tend to be rigid when they're traumatized. It also doesn't grow. So trauma very often stops emotional growth and development. So on the one hand, it's very raw and painful. On the other hand, it's even lacks sensation because scar tissue doesn't have nerve endings in it. So trauma then, just to finish, is not what happened to you. So trauma is not the difficult incident. Trauma is the wound that is sustained as a result. So the trauma wasn't, for example, the sexual abuse. Trauma was the wound that the person sustained as a result of having been abused. That's the good news, Jay, because if trauma is the wound that we sustained, it can be healed at any time. If trauma is what happened to me 75 years ago or 78 years ago, it happened. It never not will have happened. But it'll never not have happened. But if the wound is what happened to people inside as a result, that can be healed. Mm. What trauma does is it disconnects us. It splits us off from our true self and disconnects us from our emotions, even from our bodies. So that if that disconnection is the essence of trauma, then the healing is that coming together of the self to become whole again. And healing is often used synonymously with cure, fair enough, but strangely enough, in my view, and not just in my view, people can be cured from an illness without becoming whole, without healing. People sometimes also become healed without being cured. So in that sense, healing is not the absence of a physical illness, but it's the integrity of a person who's no longer split off from themselves.
I'm intrigued by how does time, we've always heard time will heal, right? Like that's an old cliche.
It won't.
Yeah, right. So let's go back to the wound and talk about, is there any relationship between time and wounds or unhealed wounds? And what is that relationship? How is that wound being formed internally? As you said, trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you. That which is happening inside of you, what is happening with that wound over time when it's left?
What happens is that it may lie dormant for a long time, and then something occurs that touches it. It's when we talk about people being triggered, for example. Something touches an unhealed wound inside you, and you react, you've just been wounded for the first time. Time does not automatically heal. Mm-hmm. Time maybe scars it over, time maybe makes it less available to immediate memory, but should something happen to evoke it, it's going to show up in its full painful impact. Mm-hmm. Until you do some work to heal. Time by itself does not heal, not spontaneously, not automatically. Because vulnerability itself is absolutely essential for growth. So vulnerability, the word itself comes from the Latin word vulnerare, to wound. So vulnerability is our capacity to be wounded. Now the reality is that as human beings, we're all vulnerable from conception until death. But when we're hurt in childhood and the vulnerability is too painful to bear, we will try and shut down our vulnerability, and for example, by being right. Because if I'm right, then I'm powerful and I can't be assailed anymore, you know? But when we do that, we stop growing. Everything in nature grows only where it's vulnerable. So a crustacean animal like a crab inside a hard shell, it can't grow. It has to molt and make itself very vulnerable to be able to grow. A tree doesn't grow where it's hard and thick, does it? It grows where it's soft and green and vulnerable. So vulnerability is absolutely essential for growth. And for vulnerability, you gotta let go of those defenses, such as being right, that you developed as a child in order to protect yourself from the pain. So that's why we talk about growing pains, because vulnerability is necessary for growth. Without vulnerability, there is no growth.
Wow, what you just said, that is so beautiful.
It has to do with the anxieties of the parents. That kid is going to download the anxieties of the parents. So mollycoddle kids become very anxious and very scared and very ungrounded in themselves. On the other hand, it's not possible to love kids too much. In fact, there's a very interesting study where they looked at a large number of mothers and their infants in the early few months. And most mothers in this study were seen as really good mothers, and some were a bit distant and because of their own traumas, not as available. And a small group were seen as like super loving in how they doted over their infants. Okay? 30 years later, they looked at these infants now as adults. The ones that were most emotionally grounded and healthy were the ones who had received the super loving. So there's a difference between, you can't love a child too much. So the mollycoddling that you describe is not a child being loved too much. It's a child who has to endure the anxieties of the parents. It has to do with the unmet needs of the parents. And as soon as parents project their needs onto the child, they no longer see the child as they exist. They see their own anxieties, their fears, and their own fantasies. Naturally, that's going to hurt the child.
Yeah, that's such a great differentiator. Again, it's a trauma response.
It's a trauma response.
Yeah, it's a trauma response. How and when should children, young adults be exposed to pain?
It's the nature of life. There's no reason to deliberately expose children to pain because they're going to experience it. The question is, how do we support them when they do? You know why? Because their puppy's going to die. Because grandfather's going to die. Because some neighborhood friend won't want to play with them. Because they're not going to get the toy they wanted. Because some disappointment will happen. So pain is inevitable, but it doesn't have to become traumatic if the child is supported in experiencing the pain and moving past it. So we don't have to impose or bring pain into kids' life to train them. Life's going to do that. The question is, how are we to interact with them while they're enduring the pain? And so grief is essential for life, because grief is coming to terms with the fact that something is gone, is not going to come back. So when a child experiences grief, and I said that the need of the child is to be able to experience all the emotions. They need to be able to experience the grief as well. Mm. And it doesn't matter whether from adult eyes we see that loss as major or minor. It's a question of how is the child experiencing it. And for a small child, even what looks like small losses can be very painful. Mm-hmm. Well, then we don't make the child wrong for it. We don't say, get over it, there's nothing wrong. Think of all the other children who are suffering, all that kind of relativistic, shaming stuff. We say, oh, it really hurts, doesn't it? You really wish grandpa would be here with you. You really wish mom and dad weren't leaving each other. It hurts. In other words, you just validate their emotions. By doing so, you help them accept the loss, and you help them move through, and you help them learn that they can endure difficult emotions without having to falling to pieces. So we have a circuitry for grief in our brain. It needs to be allowed to do its work. A therapist once said to me that if your parents didn't know how to hold you, you develop the mind you hold yourself with. So you find safety in this mind that you created. And so the human mind, the ordinary egoic human mind, is basically a defensive structure. It's, in significant ways, it's a response to pain. That's not all it is, but in significant ways, it's a response to pain. It's afraid of pain, and it's designed to keep you from experiencing pain. So it's worried, and it's anxious, and it's defensive. So when it comes to change and vulnerability, the mind wants to defend against it. And so it comes out of fear, which comes out of childhood experience, where the pain that you had wasn't held. And therefore, you develop these mind structures to keep you from experiencing it. And I mean, one of them clearly is addiction. And, you know, Keith Richards, the world's most famous former heroin addict, the Rolling Stone guitarist, said about addiction, for example, his heroin use, that the contortions you go through just not to be yourself for a few hours. Now, why would somebody not want to be themselves? Because it hurts so much at some point to be yourself. And then a mind comes in and tries to protect you from that pain of being yourself, with its ideas and its beliefs and its certainties and its endless desires and its artificial needs. And it's afraid to let go. Because if I let go, I'll be a helpless child again. So the mind largely is a defensive structure, and then often will react that way.
That defensive structure obviously sets us up for so much. What is happening inside that makes two people react completely differently to the same thing? Right? You could have a parent that's a drug addict and one of the children goes, I'm never going to have drugs ever again because I saw what it did to my parents. And the other person actually imitates the behavior and goes down the same path. What have you found or seen that at a young age creates that different journey?
Well, the first thing to say is that no two children have the same two parents, and no two children have the same childhoods, even though they grew up in the same biological family. Because first of all, one of them came along at a different time. So they had a different set of experiences. There's the birth order, that affects how children experience the parents. Then there's degrees of sensitivities. So some people are born more sensitive than others. Sensitive, again, comes from the Latin word sensere, to feel. So the more sensitive we are, the more we feel. Given the right environment, a nourishing, supportive, grounded environment, that sensitive child just becomes an intuitive, a creator, an artist, an actor, a leader. But in an environment where there's pain, that sensitive child suffers more pain than the less sensitive one. So he'll have more of a reason to escape from the pain. It's not so much that he imitates the behavior of the adult, it's that he takes the same escape route. And addictions are always, in my view at least, an escape route from pain. So it has to do with birth order, with family circumstances, degrees of sensitivity. Having said that, the other child who doesn't become an addict hasn't necessarily escaped. They just may have developed different coping mechanisms. They might have become one of these people that are going to make a big success in the world out of themselves, and they're never going to fail, and they have to be the best, and they're going to suffer too. They just might suffer in a different way.
How do you see human nature? Do you see human nature as muddied, trying to become pure, or beginning at pure and then getting muddied and then trying to go back to pure? Like, how do you see that?
Well, we do happen to have a chapter on human nature in this book, and pondering that same question that you just raised, I more or less come to the conclusion it's not that there's a definable human nature, it's not that you can say, because I mean, look, Buddha was a human being, Hitler was a human being. One is full of compassion and love and giving, the other is full of greed and aggression and hatred. They're both human beings, so how can you talk about a defined human nature? However, what I think we can say confidently, that there's a certain human potential based on human needs. If those needs are met, development will be healthy and those potentials will be realized. If those needs are frustrated, which they severely were in the case of, say, a Hitler, a terribly abused child, then what you get is the hatred and the rage and the murderous venom that characterize that personality. Now, when you couple that with political power, you see what happens. But that's not human nature. It's just human nature thwarted because the needs of that child were not met in a society that was completely incapable of meeting people's needs. In fact, totally abused them. So human nature to me is not a given. What we have is a human potential based on human needs. So if these needs are satisfied, we can be reasonably confident that people will be connected and generous. Most people want to be kind. I mean, it's interesting in a society, when somebody does something selfish or greedy, we say, that's just human nature. Do we say that when somebody's kind or generous?
Yeah, never.
The educator Alfie Kohn points that out. And if you ask most people, when does your body feel more at ease? When do you experience more peace? When you've been kind and generous and giving, authentically, not out of a sense of duty, but because that was just the impulse. Or when you're grasping and greedy, when is there more tension and more discomfort inside? So that should tell us something about our nature, that our nature wants to be aligned with connection and generosity and giving. Because our bodies will tell us that.
That is so true. That is so true. I mean, there is no time in life when you're bitter at someone or angry at someone that makes you feel good inside. Like it does, yeah, gut-wise too. I'm not just meaning in the heart space. But
So what I'm saying to people is acknowledge your own suffering, but to look to the wisdom within to promote the healing. And it's there. That wisdom to heal is inside cultures, inside peoples, and inside individuals as well. So we both have to acknowledge the suffering and not get stuck on it.
yeah,
But then to look for the healing capacity within.
yeah.
And you certainly can't wait for the world to... It's nice, but you
Yeah.
can't wait for it. Otherwise, you're dependent on somebody else for your healing.
Yeah. The first question is, what is the best advice you've ever received on healing or trauma?
Authenticity.
Expand. I'm going to ask you to expand because I want to hear now.
When I was a very confused young man and I was acting out all over the place, I had an aunt who herself was a very traumatized person. She was an Auschwitz survivor and she came back weighing 80 pounds. She was an ophthalmologist. And she saw me being inauthentic and she sent me this passage from Hamlet, that famous phrase, unto yourself be true, and it follows us night to day that then thou canst be false to any man. So be true to yourself. Without going into the details, that poor aunt of mine couldn't be true to herself because of the nature of this culture. But that advice has always stayed with me.
Yeah.
So authenticity has been a major theme in my life.
It's amazing. I love that. That's a great answer. Okay. Question number 2. What's the worst advice you've ever heard or received around trauma and healing?
Is it okay if nothing comes up for me?
Yeah, if you've never heard any bad advice, that's good. What is something that you once valued that you no longer value?
This is almost true. What other people think of me.
Yeah.
I'd be lying if I said, but at the same time, I can do without it. So it's still there, but I'm not attached to it. Yeah.
Question number 4. How would you define your current purpose in life?
My purpose is that people are free from limitations of culture and also from the limitations of their own past and of their own minds, and also free politically. So my purpose is that people are free.
It's beautiful. And 5th and final question. If you could create one law that everyone in the world had to follow, what would it be?
One rule, if I was coercing and creating the impression that one had to do anything, that already would defeat its own purpose. Because as soon as somebody has to, it's almost like, just lean forward for a minute, would you?
Yeah.
And put out your hand.
Yeah.
What do you do as soon as they push on your hand?
Resistance.
You resist. So as soon as people sense that there's a had to, there's going to be resistance. So I'm going to decline answering that question.
That's a great answer. We've never had that on the show. I love that answer. That's a brilliant answer. That's fantastic. I love the way you think.